Well, we'd like to welcome you to another class for the BYU Library Family History Center. And this one will be on using the genealogical resources of funeral homes and mortuaries. Perhaps you had never thought of that as being something important, but over the years, I've accumulated quite a bit of interest and uh, have found some records, quite a few records actually, in they're possibly available from. So we're going to go right into it. And this is kind of an interesting comment here. Don't assume that what you see today did not exist in the past. It's kind of a reversal of the way that you would think of things that don't think of the things in the past, that they still exist in the present, because we understand there are changes. But sometimes we tend to have the idea that what we have is unique and that they didn't have it years ago. And yet we would find out that in many areas, particularly those dealing with life and death and other things, are probably about the same as they have been for many, 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 many years going back. So we're going to start out by pointing out this one. This is Bucktrout of Williamsburg. It's the oldest funeral home in America. It dates back to 1759. It was a cabinet and casket manufacturer in colonial Williamsburg. And so the people who owned it got involved because when people passed away, they would make wooden caskets and provide burial on the Brook Trout farm. And then they transitioned into a funeral home. And there's a Brook Trout Williamsburg website, and there's information about that. So it's something of interest. But then what's interesting about it is that here's the records from 1916 to 1932, doesn't quite go back into the 1700s, but it's the Brook Trout Funeral Home, Williamsburg, Virginia. It's the manuscript. It's now digitized because I wasn't logged in when I showed this. The digitized camera has a little key over it. I don't know if that's clear down at the bottom of my screen, so that might not be visible to you, but that's probably because I hadn't signed in. But it's very possible that if it is a restricted record, it would be viewable at a family history center or family history library, family search library, excuse me, family search center. We're still in the transition of changing names, and it's hard to keep being consistent when you've been saying the same thing for like 40 years. And then it changes. Okay, so this is the basic kind of thing that we're talking about, is that we need to start thinking when we're doing research in genealogical research. It's historical research, and historical records of any kind, anything imaginable could have some value for genealogy. It's about people, and history is about people. And so anything in the historical context potentially has a place in genealogical research. So we shouldn't be surprised when we have something like this. Okay, so one of the first questions that comes up is, what's the difference between a funeral home and a mortuary? I think in regular speech, they're used interchangeably, but there are some differences. A funeral home can provide grief counseling, areas for service and public viewing, full planning for memorial or funeral services. And a mortuary can provide cremation services. Sometimes the viewing's closed to only family members and limited planning for memorial or funeral services. What's really happened is that some funeral homes include both mortuary and funeral services, and there's no clear distinction anymore. But they did start out a little bit different, and they were technically different businesses before. And I think that most of the mortuaries today that you would find, or funeral services companies, would be supplying a whole spectrum of services, including gravesites services and sometimes other specialized things. They're businesses, and they are in the business of making money, and so there's a reason why they would expand their services. So when you have information about a person's death, you should also be looking for possible funeral home or mortuary connection. It's just the next step. The problem I see with a lot of research is that people and the researchers, some genealogists, are satisfied. Once they have a birth, marriage, and death record, they're pretty much done. And they move on to the next person and think that, well, I'm done with that. But once again, genealogy is history. And the more you know about the person, the more likely you are to have an accurate record. And it's more interesting. It's more challenging. It's part of the whole idea of having something like genealogy that you do. If you have some other reason for doing genealogy, I mean, I talk to a lot of people today, by the way, who are um, attempting to get uh, citizenship in another country. So there are people who today who have descendants of Italy or Spain or other European countries that the countries themselves have lost some of the countries, not all, but some of the countries and some of the areas in the countries have lost population. And so they're offering citizenship under different circumstances. Some countries even sell it. You can buy citizenship in a country. So there's all sorts of motivations for doing genealogy, but I think if you're going to continue for any time period other than just a passing interest, and if you're going to be doing any kind of serious work in genealogy, you need to expand beyond just the mere name, date, place situation and get into understanding where and when and how these people lived. And that may seem overwhelmingly difficult when you get to the point where I am and some others where we have uh, tens of thousands or whatever relatives. But the core relatives back at least 3 or 4 generations, you should be pretty well familiar with the people and know where and when and how they lived and who they were. And that will quite considerably increase your interest and your understanding of the genealogical resource procedures. So don't be document blind. That is, don't assume that things don't exist. That get on, for instance, get on one of the larger websites, Family Search or Ancestry or whichever one, or MyHeritage, and go looking for records. And there's no records. I'm going to have to tell you right this up front that there's going to be almost, and except that one record that I pulled up on about the mortuary at Williamsburg, there's just there's not particularly any records. These are private businesses. They're not necessarily anxious to let a large genealogy company come in and copy their customer list in a sense. And so it's not something that they can be that are, used a lot of times. So you're not going to easily find them. You're going to have to do what I call real research, not just copying things out of records that are already sitting in front of you on a large website. You can call that research, but it's searching, but it isn't going out to areas that haven't been specifically designed to find the records. We do call researching a library to be research. So it depends on your definition, obviously, of that word. But don't just assume that there's no other way to get the records. And one of the things that's important to understand is that it helps to realize that there are a lot of documents. I'm not just talking about one or two. There are a lot of documents and permits were created when somebody dies. And this isn't something that happened in our time period and the people that are alive today. We have a lot more records than they did historically. And obviously there's preservation issues and access issues and all sorts of things as you go back into the records that do exist. But the issue here is that many of these records is why I started out with the caution that we don't assume that because we have it today that it didn't exist. And so going back in time, these records do exist. So it's not just a death certificate. Um, and by the way, death certificates, which is something I get a question about. Someone will come to me very commonly, will come and say, I've been looking for a death certificate for my great grandfather and I just can't find it. And I say, well, when did he die? Well, about 1870. And I'll go, well, they don't, in the United States, depending on the part of the country it is, not very many states in the United States had death certificates implemented until well into the 20th century. And so, you're not going to have death certificates back at that time period, particularly in Western states. And so there's a lot of these things, and knowing the time period. If you go to the Family Search Research Wiki, for example, you can look at the Research Wiki, which is on familysearch.org under the search tab, and look for any county in the United States, and it will tell you the earliest date for birth, death, and marriage, and other records, perhaps, and the date at which the records became commonly available, were consistently required by the state or the county. So you can see very easily and very quickly, just by looking at that one reference, the time depth of your common records that you have today. But that doesn't mean there aren't other records. So what we're going to start with is something that perhaps is not too familiar. It's called the Code of Federal Regulations, or CFR, which is the attorney's code acronym for this particular reference. You may not know that the Code of Federal Regulations exists, but it is a one-spot place where all of the regulations and requirements of all of the government, federal U.S. government operations are contained. It's there. It's all public information. And it tells you what are the requirements for any of the government agencies, from the IRS to the board to the National Park Service or whichever. I mean, you can start at whatever point, and this CFR has all of those. It's a huge, when I began my legal career, it was a huge whole wall collection of volumes. And it's updated constantly every time a statute is passed or a regulation is passed by any government agency. It becomes a change in the Code of Federal Regulations. So new volumes are printed constantly. That was when printing was. Now it's all done online. So you can do the search and see what's up to date and what the regulations are. Now, why is that important? Because understanding this is that you know exactly what the funeral industry practices are required to do. And if you read through that, you'll begin to understand that there are a lot of recording and reporting requirements. And so they are creating documents which can help you in your genealogical research. And so this is kind of why I started here, because this may seem like a daunting issue where it would be very difficult. And the answer is probably is. But unfortunately, that's the case with many of the types of records. And I would suggest that in some cases, the value of the record increases with its inaccessibility or its difficulty in finding it. So let me continue for just part of the time here today with a list of the possible documents, and I'll comment on each of the documents and permits, most of which are probably stored in a mortuary or funeral home. And some of these will be stored by the cemetery itself. And if it's a cemetery record or a mortuary record, it's very possible that those records, and I'll probably repeat this a number of times to emphasize it, those records could have been aggregated into some other storage or archive. So, for example, I'll give an example as I go along, but one example is that the city may own the cemetery, and so the records become city records, and then the city records may have been transmitted to a state historical society, to a state archive, or could have been transmitted to a university special collections library or a local library. There's just a kind of a long list of places that the records could end up and be contained. Now, part of how this all began, and I'm going to kind of have to tell some stories here because it helps to see how this information could be learned and why it would be important. We had a very, very unfortunate um, death in our family. And as a result of that, I ended up sitting in the office of the Mesa, Arizona City Cemetery. And as I was there in the cemetery waiting, I noticed a cabinet that had a number of records. And it looked like they were books, and they went back to into the 1800s. And so I said, the common thing which I ask is, have these records? I see you've got records here. Have they ever been digitized? And the response from the person who was there at the office said, "Oh no, oh no," and I worry about them every day because this is an isolated office, and I just don't know what could happen to these records. Well, that started for me a multi-year project. At that point, I contacted Family Search and asked them if they were interested in these records in the Mesa City Cemetery. And that's an interesting question. And I get that question from people all the time about whether or not they can get a set of records that they find digitized and made available by Family Search, if Family Search is willing to do that. And the answer back is a little complicated because it depends on the size of the collection, it depends on the location of the collection, and it depends on the allocation of the funds for the collection. But what happened in this particular case about the Mesa City Cemetery records was that Family Search was looking for a way to have a beta test. That means trying to get a software product ready for publication of their program for digitizing records. And this was back when they were developing their own program, and it's called DCAM, by the way. And that DCAM program is used by all of the different people around the world. Well, it just so happened by asking that question, and because of my own personal interest, then I connected with Family Search and spent the next 2.5 years running a beta test of their program back and forth while I digitized the records in the Mesa City Cemetery, and ended up with thousands and thousands of records digitized. But it was a process of working with back and forth with Family Search. And that collection now is on Family Search in the Family Search records and searchable. It's also been indexed, so it's on the record sets. You could just find it by looking for Mesa City Cemetery, and you'll find that set of records. So let's start into the records. And these are part of the records that I found and was not aware of before. And this is part of how I learned about it, was simply getting involved directly in working with the records on the basis of doing digital copies. The funeral rule requires that, when I say the funeral rule, that's the rules that I was talking about with the CFR and with local rules and state regulations. Funeral homes to provide certain information to consumers, including a general price list, the casket price list, the outer burial container price list, statement of funeral goods and services selected. Okay, so this is a record. In other words, they've created this thing that provides this information to the government. The government then records that. So this kind of information is available, identifying the person, the deceased, and the deceased family, obviously, at least the family members who are negotiating this particular contract with the funeral home or mortuary. And so these are all things that could start the process. And once we know that that exists, then we're going to find a lot of other records. So here are some of the copies of the records from the City of Mesa Cemetery that I digitized this. And this is just the statement that I explained earlier about the DCAM program. And the question about whether Family Search is interested in digitizing the records is not a complete question, because the issue is anyone interested in digitizing the records? And if you find records that need to be digitized, it doesn't mean they're not going to be digitized and made available. It just means that they haven't gotten to that point yet, and you could be the catalyst that initiates that digitization process. That could be happening at the city, at the state, at the county level, by private organizations, by libraries, universities. There's just a huge number of different organizations who might be interested in acquiring digital copies of those records. And so it's just a matter of looking at that. And of course, at any time we're available. I'm available through the BYU Library Family History Center to act and help and give advice about some places you might go to get the records digitized. So this is the set of records that I referred to just a minute ago. It's a collection, and there's 13,110 images. And I didn't check yesterday, but originally these records were all in color. And if they still are in color, I think they're the only color and not grayscale images on Family Search. I haven't seen any others. They really have resisted, and I'm not sure if the reason is just simply storage capacity or whatever it is, but they've really resisted having color records at Family Search for some reason. But this is what happened with these records, and if these turn out to be in grayscale, don't be surprised. Okay, so first of all, you've got the mortuary or funeral home contract. And this is a copy of a kind of a standard contract. And you can see here that there's lots of things, lots of services, and obviously there's a price for each of the services that you're going through. But what is happening here is two things that are important, initially that are important. Family members are identified, even if there's somebody who's not directly related, or somebody who is distantly related, or somebody who is acting for the family. You're going to find some people who are coming up and showing as being involved with this particular contract. In addition to that, there's some things on here that say like rosary or prayer service and things like that. Well, then you're going to begin to identify from these records and what's the way the burial, and even the mortuary itself that's handling the record, the burial, would be indication of the deceased person's religion. And of course, that's a major key in genealogical research. If you know the religion of the person you're researching, you can immediately begin looking for the associated church or synagogue or mosque or whatever other records that may be associated with that particular person. It's a very common question that I ask researchers is, do you know what religion they were? And I usually get a negative answer. I don't get an answer very often that's positive. Sometimes they say yes because we're all Catholics, or yes because we're all members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or yes because we're Presbyterians. But that doesn't always happen. And today, very few people would be immediately knowledgeable about their ancestors' religion without doing some research. And this is a good place to start because this is where they would require certain types of funeral services. Okay, so we're starting here, and then we have funeral records. Okay, so on top of that, and once again, the idea that just because today we have a program or a funeral card or whatever that is available for at a funeral that you may or may not have attended in your life, but that went on. And so here we are with the lists of people in alphabetical order in a funeral book who were attending a funeral here. And if you had lived in Mesa for as many years as we did, my wife and I did, you would recognize probably a significant number of the people's names on this list of being people and families that you have known for decades. So sometimes, if you're not familiar with genealogical research to a great extent, you may dismiss this as being, well, how much use is that? And the answer is, these people are all relatives. The primary people coming to this are either people who are associated through either social or the church connections or work connections or family members. And so if you're looking for family members and looking for names of possible relatives, then these lists are invaluable. There's no way in the world that you're not going to go through this and see how many of these people are actually related and who they are. And it fixes these people's lives at a date and time and space, which is, by the way, invaluable also for making and doing additional research. So then there's a contract. The person has to have a casket made. If you go back to frontier times and what you see depicted in movies, you may see something that looks a little bit informal. And it hasn't always been very informal because the caskets were sold and had to be made and had to be shipped and had to be used and all of that. And so there's a set of records for these contracts. Why, again, and mentioning it because it should be obvious from what I've said earlier that the people who are involved in purchasing the casket are the people who are the relatives or basically associated with the deceased person. And now we get into things that are even more, let's call it physical related. And that is rights and titles to cemetery lots. Some of us who have grown to a certain age have at some point in time thought about the possibility of passing on and have purchased a gravesite, or our family has purchased a gravesite, or we're involved in a family organization that has a cemetery, or there's all sorts of ways that this can happen. But once again, understanding that a grave, a burial grave, not when the person is cremated, but a burial grave is a physical location plot on the ground, someplace on the earth, and so that has a record because it's real estate. And in many cases, in some states, and not all, but in some states, real estate sale of cemetery lots requires recording with a county recorder in the recorder's office. If not, it may be recorded in a city or town if the city or town owns the cemetery. So understanding who purchased a plot. Let's give you a hypothetical here. Let's assume you go to a cemetery and you know that your person probably was buried in that cemetery, but there's no headstone. Well, they still could have been buried there because somebody may never have marked the grave with a headstone. But that grave and the location of that grave and the identity of the person is going to probably be in the cemetery records. And that's even more possible. It's not always possible. And I'll talk about a situation in just a little short time here where it was not necessarily made available or possible. And this is what I said, the deeds can be recorded or may be recorded by the county recorder or kept at the cemetery. Now, just a comment, this side comment has nothing to do with cemeteries. It has to do with my images here. Many of these images, by the way, are artificial intelligence generated images through either Bing, Microsoft's image generator program, or Adobe's Firefly program. So if you look at these images, you can begin to see what artificial intelligence images can, how they can be used, because I can use these images to illustrate my presentations without having to worry about copyright issues. Okay, so now we get into some other interesting documents, and these are permits for burial or removal and permit for a grave. So there's a permit that's required in most jurisdictions in the United States to open a grave and to close a grave. And there's a fee sometimes associated with it. So it's going to have a document. And these documents from the Mesa City Cemetery were from around the Salt River Valley area, the Phoenix, now Phoenix, Arizona area. And you can see from this record, they have the cause of death and then they have an age. In this case, this record here is a 3-year-old female, Janice June West, who died of laryngeal diphtheria. And this was back in 1933. And then this same record below that is the record for the burial. Now, in getting all these records, obviously there were thousands of them, and I did not check to see which ones actually had a grave marker, but it would be very usual, let's say, that a 3-year-old who died would not have had a very elaborate grave marker. It might have just said child or whatever, as I've seen very frequently. And so here we have not only the name of the person, the 3-year-old, the cause of death, the place of death, and information about the cemetery where if the burial exists. And it would be possible then to locate the grave, because it's the location of the grave is right here. And in some cases, depending on the current use of the cemetery, it may be possible to mark this grave with a grave marker if that became an issue. One of the problems with cemeteries is not with the records, it's with the cemeteries, that because graves are real estate, and because real estate, if not just free in a sense, the graves have a tendency to disappear because they're not necessarily going to be in the place where the person was originally buried, or in some instances they're unmarked and then they're unused and then they disappear. So the cemetery may no longer in existence. That does not mean that the records have disappeared. So if we suspect that it was a cemetery, it may be possible. Where that is unlikely to have happened is in what is a common practice across the United States, is to have private cemeteries that really weren't in this permit government process. And if that's the case, it may take more research than simply, it may take research into newspapers or into church records or into a lot of other records out there. But by and large, you're going to find that that there are more records, even similar kinds of records that were created at the time. And these all start with the mortuary, because they're the ones, besides the city in this case, who are requiring these records to be filled out. So here's lot records for people who have not claimed the graves. In other words, there's people that have been buried here who have never come back. City cemeteries, and maybe in some of the commercial cemeteries and others, require the relatives to either buy some kind of a permanent insurance plan where they will continue to maintain the grave into the future, Or if they don't, then it's very possible that the graves will not be, let's say, preserved any further, and they'll be redone. Also, you have to remember that in some cemeteries today, and it's the same in the past, that they have multiple burials in the same cemetery plot, and the buried people buried on top of each other, and often they're what they're called mass graves, where people are just buried in a multiple people buried at the same time. Sometimes those people are not located. Now, one of the interesting things about this is that as I look at this record, this one happens to be also from this city cemetery in Mesa, Arizona. And I see names on there that I recognize, that some of those would be people who are potentially relatives of mine. And also, I know there's at least one name on here which is associated with one of the mortuaries in Mesa and Phoenix, and also into Nevada. And we go way back, just so you'll see something that's not current. Here's a coroner's report on the death of Amy Robsart, an official document. Now, in England, which this practice has not completely, but has disappeared, there's some controversy or difficulty or problem, criminal activity or whatever that happens with a death. In previous times, there were even more records because every death had to go through what was called an inquest. And the inquest process was handled by the coroner, who was the official government appointee or employee who handled that. And the inquests were presided in historically by judges from the court. And it was like a civil proceeding. It was like a proceeding. It could be criminal or civil, depending on how the evidence was going to be presented. The idea was it was to determine the cause of death and also to determine whether or not there was any culpability or further criminal actions that needed to be made. And these records are voluminous, and they are, to a lot of extent, they're just court records. And so they're going to be available wherever court records are found. And that's a whole different subject, but that's part of this whole process here. So you can look here for death certificates in the inquest records of the report of the examination, because there had to be someone go out and interview and determine the actual cause of death. And there had, in many cases, an autopsy performed by the authorized medical personnel from the county or the state or wherever that determined ultimately what the cause of death was. There may be tissue, organ, and body donation issues, all of that kinds of things that happened. Here's, for example, the rules and regulations and how this all happens from the state of Utah. So for funeral homes, this is the kind of thing that you can expect to find online or recorded or available from the cities, towns, counties, wherever, or the state, that describes all of these services. And if you begin to understand that for each of the services, there's going to be a record of what occurred, and that those records are probably kept. In my discussions with one of my friends who owned a very large mortuary, very active one in Arizona, I was talking to him about records, and he said, well, our records in the mortuary go back to the 1800s, and we have those records. Well, they're not necessarily anxious, as I mentioned, to have those digitized, but they are available and can be searched. And so there's the ways that happened. And one other thing that I've noticed over the years is that mortuaries never go out of business. They may change business hands, but there always has to be somebody in that particular geographic area that does this business. And so as people die or sell their business or move on, those records are part of the value of the business, and they accumulate in the business. So there's a not just a natural tendency to retain all the records, but there's a practical reason for retaining the records. That's the records of your customer base, in a sense. So that's why that's important. And in one case, for example, I was trying to track down where one of my great-great-grandfathers was buried, and that was problematic, and I could not find it. Did have no idea where he was buried. And then I did find it. I finally found where he was buried, and it was buried in a large cemetery outside of Philadelphia, in a major cemetery, a gigantic cemetery outside of Philadelphia. And in getting there, I found out that the interesting thing about the burial is that there was about between 5 and 10 years from the date of death before the burial. And I was thinking, well, what did they do? Keep this guy in the living room or something before they buried him? How does this happen? And then in doing more research in the Philadelphia City archives, I found a set of records generated with the WPA back in the 1930s of burials, and I found out his original burial date was in downtown Philadelphia. And in Philadelphia, they didn't care if there was a cemetery, they just dug up everybody and moved their bodies to a different cemetery. And of course, that makes things difficult. But that's what was happening. So here's a transport from the Office of the Medical Examiner. That's a record. A death certificate clearance before burial. That's another record, not the death certificate. It's a clearance of the death certificate. An out-of-state transport and cremation clearance record. An international transport contagious disease letter record. A release of the bodies and personal effects record or document. And corrections to the death certificate information. So here's a list of additional types of records that could have been created in conjunction with the deceased person. Once again, the job of the genealogical researcher is to find these records, and that's what we do. In other words, it's the process of determining that a record like this may have been in existence. So, for instance, my grandfather, who died in California, was buried here in Utah, up in the Salt Lake City cemetery. So there has got to be document about the out-of-state transport, and there's got to be other records that are available, and those would be available from beginning with the mortuary and the location where the death occurred. So, in addition, if you want to start thinking about it, there are more records from hospitals, physicians, law enforcement, and insurance companies. All of these kinds of records. And if you are questioning whether or not these records are available, where they are, whatever else, I mean, that's the job. That's what we do. We find out where these records are and what we can do with them. Okay, so let's stop. How do I go about finding and using all these records? What is it that I need to do to get these records discovered? Again, it's the main activity. That's what we do. And learning how to do this and asking the questions and say, it's just a research process here. What you're doing is you're asking a question and you're trying to find out where and who can answer that question for you. And if you understand all of the process here of the burial process, then you will obviously be able to determine that you could begin with a death certificate. If it doesn't exist, then you begin with any other kind of death record, newspapers. You go back and look on old maps and old business directories and city directories and look for mortuaries in the area, and then start contacting the current mortuaries and asking them how far back their records go. And I mean, there's this process that goes through looking for any records, whether I'm looking for corporate records or railroad records or mining records or anything that has to agricultural records or anything else. there's this whole process that you look for, that you go through when you're looking for the records. And of course, what you can do is at the same time, you can always ask questions. And as mentioned, we have a digital virtual online help center at the BYU Library Family History Center that you can click into and start asking questions if you have any questions. So go to the BYU Library Family History Center website, and there's a link and the times when we're available. So the mortuary or funeral home would have to know about all these records and all these procedures. It's not quite as simple of a business as you might think. It is fairly technical, involved with a lot of legal and cultural and religious restrictions. And it is fairly difficult to get this whole thing to go through that process. And of course, if you've been through the process because the death of someone that you know or a loved one or a close relative, then you know that there's a lot more complication out there, and there's a lot more other things that could have been created along with the family records and family recordings of the burials and records and diaries and all of these other things. So there's just sort of a cloud of records that thing. And the whole point here is you have to know what to ask for. So you'll recall that I started with the Federal Register of Records of statutes, because knowing what kinds of things are required of the mortuary gives you an opening, because you can say to them, well, you must have done this kind of record because you're required to produce that record. And they could say, well, they're private records. And you'll say, well, dead people don't have any privacy. Well, the other people do. Well, in other words, you're going to run into those kinds of difficulties and problems. So, but in a lot of cases, if these records were created by some kind of government agency, then the argument is one of whether or not there's really any reason why the records should not be made public. And that's why we have what are called Freedom of Information Acts around the United States. And in almost, I'm assuming every state would have one of those. So here's a online directory. None of the examples I'm giving here are in any way necessary. In other words, it's not going to help you to have the links to these, because these are just general kinds of places and records that you would be looking for. And so here's U.S. Funerals Online. I have no idea what this what this company is doing, or whether it really is U.S. or if it's just some place that uses that in its name. And so this is or this particular record. So in other words, I'm not giving you a list of links or places to go. I'm illustrating the kinds of records that you might be able to find. This National Directory of Morticians. These are ones that I just picked off of the website. This one I did, it's the redbookfuneraldirectory.com. And you can also use Google Maps to look for funeral homes or mortuaries in a specific location. So I did a search here for mortuaries, whatever, and put that on Google Maps, and I have little red dots all over Topeka, Kansas. Then you could do the same thing for any other part of any other thing, churches, anything else on Google Maps that you want to look for. So think in terms of the process of what happens when a person dies, what records could have been created by that particular process, and assume that there is a record for almost anything that happens. For example, if a person died or got sick at home and was transported from home to the hospital, there's an ambulance record. Whoever ran the ambulance company, and if it was licensed from the state, there would be some kind of report made of that particular journey. So there's just thinking in that That's the way of thinking that there's always more records. There just are always more records. Okay, well, thanks for watching.